Good evening, dear participants, and good morning, Jennifer. I think we're ready to start. And welcome to our webinar of professional development for English teachers in Kazakhstan. This is our 7th webinar, and today we have a speaker, Jennifer Rice. And the topic of the webinar is research-based activities to teach listening instead of testing listening. So Jennifer has been a university instructor teaching English to speakers of other languages for over 12 years in the USA, South Korea, Japan. She has also been involved with the United States Department of State e-Teacher online program, training teachers from around the world. She specializes in teacher training for English for specific purposes, academic listening, speaking and reading curriculum development, and also English for science classes. Actually, also this is what we need for Kazakhstan now. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you very much for agreeing to be our speaker today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Elena, and everyone. I'm glad that we're all here today. And today I am hoping to talk with you about research-based activities to teach listening instead of testing listening. So I'm going to go back and forth between my video and my PowerPoint, mostly focusing on my PowerPoint. So I'll also take questions in the chat box. Hopefully you know where that is. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now and my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Can you see more?
So you're welcome to unmute yourself or write in the chat if you want to make some comments or agree or disagree with the speaker. So please give us some sign that you see the PowerPoint. I don't see any messages in the chat. Tatiana, do you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Yes, I know that is okay.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, then I'm going to get started. First of all, I've been teaching listening for a very long time here in the US and also in South Korea and in Japan. And I've always, prior to this year, been focused on using a textbook. And today I want to talk to you about how we can sort of get away from using a textbook and focus really on teaching listening instead of just testing it, because that's basically what is happening when we are using textbooks. So I want you to think for a minute about what an ESL listening instructor's overall goal is. When we teach listening, what is our overall goal? Just think about that for a couple seconds. Okay, so hopefully, after I've thought about this for a while, hopefully you came up with the same thing as I did. Reflecting on teaching listening after many years, I decided that actually my overall goal is to generate good listening habits that transfer in my students. I don't want them to be able to just listen to one specific lecture or one specific conversation and understand it. I want them to build skills that they can use in any listening situation in the future. And so recently I redesigned my whole listening pedagogy, and now I'm focusing on these things, how to teach habits that will transfer in my students. And that's what I want to share with you today. I did a lot of research with it along with my husband, and we shared a lot of information together and built a new course, and we feel pretty proud about it. So this is what we researched. So listening proficiency actually is composed of 4 different things: grammatical competency, sociolinguistic competency, discourse competency, and strategic competency. Those 4 things all come together to give us good listening proficiency. And I'm going to talk about what each of those things means in the webinar. Basically, you have top down and bottom up skills that you're focusing on. And bottom up skills are the little details, and top down skills are the bigger picture. And today I'm going to talk about in detail how we can practice each of those in class to help our students improve their listening and be able to transfer it to other situations. So if we add top-down processing and bottom-up processing and something we call metacognition to a listening course, that is going to give us this, that is going to give our students the skills they need to apply those listening proficiencies in future situations. Not down here at the bottom of the PowerPoint, you can see I don't want to have comprehension questions for specific listening excerpts. That's not what I'm looking for in a listening course. So today we're going to talk about how that can actually happen. So again, just take a few seconds, and if you want, you can chat your ideas in the box. What does metacognition mean to you? What do you think that means? Again, if you could type your ideas in the chat box, that would be great. Okay, it doesn't look like anybody wants to share what they think it means, and that's okay. It's kind of a big word, and okay, I'm getting some ideas here now. To know how to listen, understanding, comprehension on a bigger level. Okay, so to me, metacognition means thinking about and evaluating how you think about something. So this is kind of what the research means. Meta means above and beyond. And cognition is thinking. So you're thinking above thinking or thinking about thinking when we're talking about metacognition. And that's really what we want our students to start doing in listening courses and really any English course. We want them to think about thinking. So here are some metacognitive strategies that we can use in our listening courses to help our students think about and evaluate their thinking about listening. You were given a document, I think, before the webinar that you were able to access on email, and it has a listening self-awareness checklist in it. That's one of the things that my husband and I developed to be able to allow our students to kind of get a feeling of what they are doing correctly and what they need to improve as far as their listening skills go. And this checklist is based on a book called Second Language Listening, Metacognition in Action. It's a really good book by Vandergrift and Go. And also we use it in the class as a tool to see where students are and what skills they need to improve on. And also I use it at the end of the course to show students how much they've actually learned during a listening course. And so it looks like this. This is just the first part of it, but you have the whole thing on the document that you downloaded. And basically what it is based on research, what students should do, the process of getting ready to listen, and then what they should do while they're listening, and then finally what they should do after they listen. And so students go through the checklist and they just mark what is true for them right now. Do they, before listening, think about the topic and what they already know about it? Yes, usually, not often, or no. And what I tell students is if they've checked things in the not often or no columns on this paper, those are the things that they need to focus on and start trying to do during our listening course. And by the end of the course, I hope that students have a lot more check marks in the yes column and in the usually column for this checklist. And so it lays out, very clearly for students what they need to do in order to be successful as an English listener. And so if anybody has any questions about that you could save those for the end, and I would be more than willing to answer questions about that. Okay, another metacognitive strategy that I've used in my course and my husband and I developed is the types of listening problems and remedies for those problems. So, sorry, I'm hearing some other feedback here. Okay, so some of the students, all of the students, have listening problems. And knowing what exactly those problems are is a big part of learning how to listen better. If we don't know what we're doing poorly, then we can't really start to improve. And so what I encourage my students to do is to use this chart to help them figure out what actually the problems they're having are. And then we talk about how they can solve those problems. So it's a self-assessment tool. They just think about it for their own situation. And then in groups, usually we brainstorm solutions about what they could do to solve these problems they're having with listening. And again, this is in that packet that you were given, the documents before the webinar. And it looks like this, but it's a lot longer than this. It's several pages long. And basically, we decided to break it up into bottom-up and top-down problems that students might have so that they can see where their weakness is and where their strengths are, and then build on their listening skills from there. Okay, and again, if you have any questions about this, we can talk about it at the end. I'll save time, I promise. Another metacognitive strategy that I've used in my class is the listening task guide. And this is also in that packet of information that you got. The listening task guide is basically a template that you can use for all listening excerpts. So any kind of listening that you have students do, you can use this task guide. If you teach very low English level learners, you might want to adapt this and bring it down. This is geared toward intermediate level English learners, and I'm teaching a course that's trying to get them ready for academic listening at the university level. So that's what the language in the task guide is geared toward, but you could always adapt it to fit your situation. And it looks like this. On the one that I give the students, I leave space between these items on the list so that the students are able to actually write down their answers here. Or you could do it in an online format where students just type in their answers and submit it as a document to you. But really, the whole purpose of this is for the students to go through this process for every listening that they do. And so each time we have a listening in the course that I designed, we do a task guide, and it gets them into the habit of going through this process. Before you listen, what do you do? Well, there are 5 steps here. And by the end of the course, the students know those 5 steps. They really have that in their brain now, and they don't really even need a paper. They realize, this is what I'm supposed to do before I listen. That's what the listening task guide is all about. So you can see there are 10 steps total in the listening task guide. And basically, it just leads them through the process of what we want them to do while they listen. The piece that I feel like has always been left out of textbooks that I feel is really necessary for the metacognitive portion of this is numbers 8, 9, and 10 here on the form. The evaluation, or what you do after you listen. I think a lot of times textbooks don't do these things, don't have students think about their thinking, think about their listening skills. And so I feel like that is a piece that definitely is needed for students to be able to improve in their listening skills. So here we ask them to rate how well they understood something, and then what problem did they have, and then they're referred back to that problem chart that we just talked about previously. And then how are they going to improve in the future? That's number 10. What can they do to do better next time? And I think that's a really important piece, to not just stay at the same level you're at, but improve. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about metacognitive strategies that we can use in listening courses, and now I want to switch gears and talk about top-down processing. So what do you think top-down processing is? So go ahead and chat your thoughts in the chat box if you would. Top-down processing. Any ideas to share? Okay, I don't see anybody's thoughts coming up here, so, I'm gonna proceed. So according to the research, top-down processing is using background knowledge to understand the message. So all of the knowledge that we have in us already, we bring with us every time we listen to something, and we use it to help us understand the message. That's what top-down processing is, and that has to be part of a listening course. So the three big pieces of top-down processing are, number one, discourse competence. So that's understanding how a listening is organized. So for example, are they comparing and contrasting something? Or are they giving you a definition of a word and then an example of it? We use these patterns when we speak. We use these patterns, especially in academic lectures. And so if we can recognize and get our students to recognize these patterns, it helps them predict what will come next in the lecture or how they should organize it in their brain. About what they're listening. The second thing that is part of top-down processing is sociolinguistic competence. And that is understanding social and cultural expectations of what will be said in a certain context. So for example, you go to the doctor's office. You expect the doctor to say certain things when you're there. Another example, when you enter a classroom, you expect a professor or a teacher to say certain things in a certain way to you. And if you get an instructor who is very casual or very relaxed and uses slang, it's surprising to you. That's because in our brains, we have a social context about how that person should speak. And so when somebody does something that's a little different, it really surprises us. And these are things that students bring with them every time they listen to something. The third piece about top-down processing is strategic competence, or the fact that we are actively listening for a purpose and knowing how to cope with difficulties when we face them while listening. So, for example, you're listening to something, there are lots of new words, you're not sure what to do. Part of strategic competence is knowing how to deal with that situation. And so trying to build students' strategic competence is really important in a listening course. So they can take a deep breath, write down what they think they heard, and then ask somebody about it later, for example. So here are ways that students can actually practice top-down processing skills in a listening class. So we want them to basically compare what they think they know to what they think they heard, and then identify the gaps in understanding. So what they think they know compared to what they think they heard, and how are those things the same and how are those things different? You can do this by getting students to generate questions. So they listen to something and then basically they pretend or play professor. So they imagine that they were the person speaking. And after they've taken notes on what they heard, they use those notes to then make some quiz questions or test questions. And they use those questions to ask other groups of students in the class. So essentially, they are pretending like they are the professor who just gave that talk or whatever they were listening to. And this question generation is really a big part of metacognitive strategies too, because it makes students make connections with what they just heard. And so it's not only top-down processing, but also metacognitive too. I also have students restructure their notes often. So they take notes initially in some format, whatever format works best for them, on whatever lecture we're listening to or whatever listening excerpt we're listening to. And then I ask them to take those notes and restructure them in some way. So they make an advertisement, perhaps, about whatever was said in the listening. Or they create a mind map, possibly. So a mind map is little bubbles with lines drawn to the other pieces of it and how they're connected. They might just make a different style of notes on their paper. So they took notes in one style and then asked them to convert it to another style. Or possibly just write a summary in a couple sentences of what they heard using their own words. So when they restructure these notes, they're taking all that top down, all that stuff that they know already, and they're applying it to what they heard to see if it makes sense. A great thing that you can do for any kind of listening is have students listen to something, again, take notes on it, and then have them teach that thing to other people. So in my course, one thing I do is a jigsaw type activity. Maybe you're familiar with that term. Often it's used for reading. So students will read different passages and then they will teach that passage to other students in the class. Well, in a listening class, they can have each a different listening, or maybe you have 3 or 4 different listenings that students listen to. And then they teach the other people who didn't listen to that one about the one that they listened to. So I find this really rewarding, especially if it's on a topic that is really interesting to students. I do something about social responsibility and being a responsible consumer. And I have students listen to different videos and then come to class and teach other students about it. And it's really successful. Students get into it. I think they like being teachers. Also, you can combine a lot of these techniques together to create some new activity in class that you have the students do. So one thing I've done that combines a lot of these is quick response simulations. Here in the US, in university classes, students have a very short time in which they are able to ask questions or able to respond in a lecture class. And so we want students to practice those skills, and I've developed some ways to do that. Basically, they listen to a professor speaking, a video of a professor speaking, and then immediately afterward, they need to ask a question to that professor about something they didn't understand. And this is very quick. There are only 30 seconds to be able to generate that question for that professor. Another thing that I have them do is to talk with a partner very quickly about what they just heard and try to answer a professor's question that a professor has posed. So again, getting these skills combined is really helpful to develop these top-down processing skills. And again, we can talk more about this in the questions at the end. Bottom-up processing. What is bottom-up processing? So let's just think about that for a minute. If top-down processing is bringing all of that background knowledge and comparing it to what you hear, what would bottom-up processing be? Okay, so I'm seeing understanding on the word level, listening for details. Yes, that's what I would think too. And so this is going to be a lot of words all at once on the slide, words to sentences. Yes, so you have definitely the right idea here. Basically, the research says this is using details to understand the message. So we use those words, we use the grammar, we use the pronunciation that we hear a speaker saying to understand that message. And we've broken this down into 3 parts: grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. And we call these three things together grammatical competency. So it's one of those 4 competencies that we were shown at the beginning that make up listening proficiency. And grammatical competency is sometimes the most focused on in a textbook. And other times it's not focused on at all. So I think it just depends on who publishes the textbook and what they are comfortable with. But a lot of times it's either the only focus or it's completely missing from a listening course. And so I definitely feel like this is one piece that we could do better with, especially in the US. And so my husband and I really focused on bringing a lot of this back to the classroom. I think it used to be there many years ago, and there was a swing away from this approach. And now I feel like it needs to be put back in to get that whole rounded picture of listening proficiency. So in the class, we focus on grammar, the structures that students are hearing. We focus on vocabulary a lot. We focus on pronunciation, the stress that a speaker is using with their voice, the intonation that a speaker is using, and the pauses that a speaker uses. And we practice that in the course because all of those details help us to understand the message. And here are some ways that we do that. So I allow the students to do partner dictations, or I give them a chance to do partner dictations. Basically, that means one student is given one set of sentences or a short paragraph, and another student is given a different set. Usually these incorporate the vocabulary that we're using in the course, and then they have to read out those sentences to their partner while their partner writes down exactly what they're hearing. The trick is to not let them look at the other person's paper, right? Because a lot of times they just want to look on over and copy down the sentences. So having them sit back to back so that they cannot see each other's papers helps with that. And then also during this activity, if they need to hear something again or they didn't understand what their partner said, they need to practice that language of, sorry, could you say that again? Or I don't understand what you mean. Can you say that again? Or something like that. So they're getting speaking practice in there too, along with listening practice. So I really like partner dictations, and students seem to like it a lot too. Of course, close exercises, which you're probably familiar with, are a good way to do this bottom-up processing. That is when you have the transcript of whatever you are listening to and you blank out every third or fourth or eighth or whatever word, and the students have to listen very carefully and fill in that word. Oftentimes, students can do that without even listening. And so that's kind of the problem. If their grammar is really good, a lot of times they can just fill in those blanks. So we want to make sure that we're focusing on parts of the listening that we want to bring attention to in these close exercises. I do a lot of sentence transcription with students. So again, I use the transcript of the listening excerpt, and I have them basically just write down exactly what they hear. I read the sentences slowly, and then the students are writing down exactly what they hear. And then we check it with the video after they've had a chance to compare with a neighbor and maybe fix it and do the best they can to come up with what they think is being said. And then we actually check it with the video. So that is a really good way to practice bottom-up skills. A lot of times we focus on transition signals. So again, this is when the speaker says, and another point is blah, 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 or now we're going to move into blah. And just focusing on those phrases that speakers use when they're talking to organize their thoughts, that is really important and helpful for our students to understand the message. So you can do this by a technique called paused transcription. So this is a technique in the literature that you can read up on after this webinar if you're interested. But basically, as you're playing a listening excerpt, you stop it every so often. And when you stop it, then the students are supposed to write down the last chunk of language they heard. Usually that's 4 or 5 words that they heard just before you stopped it. And so the purpose of this is to get the students to really hold that information in their head long enough to make a meaning from that chunk of language before they let it go. Instead of having a word go through their brain and another word and another word and another word, you want them to take language in chunks instead of word by word. And so this pause transcription technique helps with that. And so if you're focusing on transition signals, for example, you would pause the listening just after a transition signal and then have the students try to figure out or remember what that transition signal was that they just heard. So it's an interesting technique, and there's a lot of resurgence of it lately in the literature. So take a look at that. We also focused a lot in the course on language associated with discourse patterns. Again, if the lecture is set up like a compare-contrast lecture or a cause-effect lecture, oftentimes you don't just have one, you have many different discourse patterns connected and intertwined within one lecture. And so getting students to recognize that is important. I did a lot in my course with receptive pronunciation skills. So getting students to listen to something and notice when the tone drops, and that signaling the end of a speaking turn, or understanding reduced speech, meaning things like gonna, wanna, have to. We use that kind of reduced speech to speak quickly in English, and a lot of lectures and a lot of native speakers do that. And so students need to be able to understand what that actually means. They don't have to produce it. I'm not going to make students say, I want to do this, or I'm going to do this, but they need to understand what that reduced speech actually means when they hear it. And then vocabulary instruction is, of course, a huge part of any skill for a language learner. And in my course and in the course that I developed, it's definitely more than just memorizing words. It's what collocations go with those words. How do you use those words in speaking? What do they sound like? All sorts of pieces of knowing that word. And I could give a whole other presentation on that, but I'm not going to do that today. Maybe next time. Okay, so basically we have top-down processing. We have these bottom-up processing skills. And we put metacognition in there, or thinking about how we think about these things. And that gives us a course that transfers to other listening. That was a very strange sound. Other listening contexts. So we are developing good listening habits that transfer. That's what we want to do. And we don't want to do a listening course that just involves comprehension questions for a specific listening excerpt. That is definitely not going to help our students in the future with different types of listening that they encounter. So we want to be the instructor that builds good habits, not just lets the students get a good score on the multiple choice test. And I just want to share with you a few references here. Some of these are articles, and some of these are video series, and some of these are books. And I would really encourage you to check out a lot of them, especially the Stephen Chu video series. This is on YouTube. It's How to Get the Most Out of Studying. It's a really great video series that I actually use as listening content in my listening courses. And it's all about how students should study. So how to be a good student. What could be more relevant to students than how to be a good student? It's a very good series, and the speed and the clarity is really good in those videos. So I would encourage you to use that if you're with intermediate or advanced English language learners. Also, the last thing listed on here is very good book that I would encourage anybody who's really interested in listening to read. Teaching and Learning Second Language Listening, Metacognition in Action. It's a great book. It's pretty recent, and so I feel like it's a really good one to devote some time to. Okay, So we definitely have enough time for questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat, or you could ask. I'm going to be quiet here and let you do the talking now.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. So if you have some questions, please unmute yourself or write the questions in the chat. I have a lot of questions, but I wait for other participants to ask questions first. So there is one question from Tatiana. Discourse competence is similar to functional use of language?
So let's see. So discourse competence is basically, it's related to functional use of language, yes. And I would say that functional use of language would fall into that category, but it's a little bit bigger than functional use of language. So if we want to know the discourse competence of something, we need to know, first of all, what style is it? Is it an essay? Is it a report? Is it an academic lecture? Is it a conversation between friends? That kind of thing. So you need to look at the bigger picture and then understand, if it's a conversation between friends, what does that mean? How are they going to speak to each other? What organizational patterns are you going to hear normally? So it's knowing what style of listening you're talking about. Functional language is a piece of that, yes, for sure. Do you teach specifically every type of competence? So I don't actually tell the students about these different competencies, but yes, I teach all 4 of the competencies in the class. We don't focus so much on the sociolinguistic competencies in class because that is something that they develop naturally because they're here in the US. When I was teaching overseas, yes, I taught more about that sociolinguistic competence and what to expect when you walk into an academic setting here, or when you walk into a grocery store here. But I don't do a lot of that here in the US because students are here and they're living that piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Jennifer, I have a question about video and audio. So you mentioned several times that you're using video for listening.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern is that when our students are taking some tests like TOEFL or IELTS,
Mm-hmm.
they're not supposed to watch a video, so they will listen. And how will, is it okay to use video just for teaching listening? Or should we at some stage transfer to using only audios?
Just audio. Well, there is some research out there that says if you're using video and audio together, it's actually distracting for students listening. So I would say that it would be great if you could get your students to focus just on the audio. I think that would allow them to concentrate better. Actually, a lot of times the video is distracting or not really useful. It's just a person's head, right? So the thing that we can get from seeing somebody when they're speaking is their expression and sort of their tone, and if they're being really serious or if they are joking and smiling while they're talking. That's the thing that you miss with the audio or audio only. But I feel like a lot of times the videos are distracting, and many times when I look around, the students actually aren't looking at the video. They're down writing notes anyway. So I think it's fine to only use audio, especially if that's all you can do. Definitely it's fine. I don't really see much benefit to using video.
Okay, thank you.
But another point is that we actually teach listening not just to take IELTS or TOEFL, but to develop this skill. That's why video is a useful, really useful tool. You shouldn't think that, every time students need to take IELTS. So we care about their listening skills. So that's why, it's a good point, to use videos.
Sure. Yeah, I feel like a lot of times we're drawn back to that test, right? What's the test? what are they going to cover? But yeah, that's a really good point. There's a lot more to it than just that test.
Okay, so, and can you recommend some materials that can be used in class for intermediate level, or besides those you mentioned?
Sure. So for me, I do a lot of searching for TED Talks. I'm sure most people are familiar with those. So at the intermediate level, I look for short TED Talks, maybe no more than 10 minutes. And I also look for things posted by organizations. So for example, when I'm having students learn about being a responsible consumer, I have things posted from NGOs or nonprofit organizations that they make short little videos to inform the public about the issue at hand. And so those videos are usually only 3 to 4 minutes long. And I find them really great for giving a basic overview of the issue or the concept. And they're usually really clear. They're made for the general public. So I search online and get all my videos online now. I used to use things from textbooks, but I found that actually a lot of them are just people reading a script, and it's not very authentic. And for the level that I'm teaching, it's not a great fit for my learners, because the intonation and the pausing and everything is very, very different when you're reading something than when you're just speaking it as a presentation. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and most of our teachers associate listening skill just doing comprehension check questions. So you're absolutely right raising this issue at the very, very beginning.
Right, and I think that's not just where you are. I think that's everywhere, actually. All the textbooks are geared around that. I just presented the same presentation at a conference in Monterey, California, and the whole audience was saying that too, and they were all instructors here in the US for the most part, not all, but yeah, I think it's everywhere. I think it's a move that needs to happen and is starting to happen slowly as we learn more about it. But yeah, getting away from just those comprehension questions is really important.
Jennifer, I'm administrating TOEFL, and I've noticed that some of the students, during listening, they make notes of every detail, of every detailed information. Sometimes I get this very destructive. How to teach them to avoid, making notes of because you were speaking about interpretation. It's really nice, and I ask them to interpret this information differently and extend vocabulary stock. But sometimes it jot down everything. Right. So any tip?
Right. That happens with my students too. Again, I think that's a universal problem. I try to get them to focus on not the words, but the ideas. So I stress that again and again and again. Do not write specific words you hear, but write ideas. And to help them with that, I often just stop a video and say, write down the idea right now. And I get them into that habit of writing down ideas, not words, but ideas. And I even say that you can write it in your native language. That's fine. I feel like if they can convey the information in their native language more quickly, go for it. Because again, that's writing ideas, not words. And so I really encourage them. I share with them several different styles of note-taking that they can try. And one of them is the Cornell note-taking method. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's pretty famous. They divide their paper into 2 columns. And on the left side, they write a summary of what they have on the right side. So as they listen on the right, they're writing, the ideas as they hear them, and then they summarize on the left, or write questions on the left about, what they didn't understand or anything. So it kind of separates the metacognitive work from the actual train of thought as they're listening. That's an idea. But yeah, getting them to focus on those chunks of meaning instead of just individual words. My husband calls that individual word writing verbal confetti. It's just words all over the page, and it doesn't have any meaning. Another thing that I try to get them to see is the importance of structure in their notes and organizing. And I have some activities where I actually, it's not even a real language, but I have the notes structured in a way that they can answer questions about those notes. So I say, what is the main idea? And they say, is this English? And I say, well, what is the main idea? And they can find it because the notes are structured in an organized fashion. So I've had success with that in showing that once you take notes, if it's messy and you can't do it all at once, you can't organize it, take time afterward to organize it. I think that's a big piece also, is just that taking time to think about what you just heard and write it down in a way that makes sense to you. So, yeah. I see another question here. Some textbooks provide audio with a variety of accents. My opinion is that they are not helpful at lower levels. Students need some model for better comprehension. What do you think? It's a good question. Accents are definitely challenging for students. At the lower levels, I kind of agree with you that you need to focus more on vocabulary and getting those chunks of language in the brain long enough to make meaning from it, and maybe not necessarily worrying about accent too much. But on the other hand, I have students here at the university who have professors who are from India or other places in the US, and they really struggle because they're not used to that accent. So I'm not sure if there's a correct answer for that. Having exposure early on may have helped them with that and may not. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into the research about that.
Okay. So Jennifer, I have a question about PowerPoint that you were sharing today. Can you send it to me so that I can share it with the participants, because there are some readings there and some activities. Actually, we've been using partner dictation, but a little bit different. Okay. So we call it a running dictation. So usually I stick a paper with some sentences with the vocabulary we were using, and then one of the students is running there, reading and then coming back. But I like your idea that we should encourage students, if they didn't understand and use this language, could you say that again? Could you repeat? Because this also involves speaking practice. So yeah. I will add this little addition to this activity now.
Yeah, that's great. And the running dictation, I've done that before too, in a reading course. In a listening course, it's a little bit trickier. You'd have to have them run and listen to something and come back. So they could do it though, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. The piece about them using the language to ask for clarification, that is really important, because I feel like if you're in a English as a foreign language setting and everyone speaks the same language, it's so easy for them to just slip back into their native language and ask those types of questions. But those types of questions are so key to actually using English in another setting. And so I have students who are mostly Chinese in my class. And so it's a battle for me to get them to actually use English a lot of times, because they can just use Chinese and talk to each other. So that's one way that I try to get them to practice that, is just using English.
Okay, yeah, I've seen it in many classes here at AEI, that Chinese and other Saudi Arabian students just switch to the L1.
Yeah.
And this is the same problem in Kazakhstan. So students either switch to Kazakh or Russian, and
yeah. Same in South Korea, same in Japan when I taught there. It's comfortable, it's easy, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. It happens everywhere.
Yeah. So do we have any other questions or maybe comments?
The only comment is big, huge thanks for such deep, detailed, materials. Well, we are looking forward to your PowerPoint. Because, well, I read a lot, and this is mostly, well, I guess the first time we see all these 4 competencies, well, in developing listening skills. Because usually we speak about scanning, skimming skill, yes, listening for specific information, but none of these, well, discourse competence or social linguistic competence or any other. So please, we are looking forward for your materials.
Thank you. I'm glad it was useful, and I hope that you can use it in all your listening classes in the future. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, I also have written down some activities that I can use with my students to improve their listening skills. And so we will follow back with feedback form, and you can write some comments or questions that you have, and then I will make sure to send it to Jennifer, and she will have a follow-up with them.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciated it.